their preferences and their willingness to pay. So they were presented with power generators, biomass, and solar PV panels. And along with these alternatives, they had to consider who was producing it, how much they were going to pay for it, the service quality. Yeah. So this is an example of a choice card that was presented to the respondents. Overall, we presented 550 questionnaires to households and then 250 questionnaires to firms. We had a total of 498 at the household level and then 200 at the firm level. Because of time, I'm just going to move ahead to the results. So this is the results we had from the study. We employed a mixed logic model in order to examine their preferences. At the end of the study, we realized that there was a very high preference of solar PV panels. Interestingly, we realized that most of the firms we interviewed, about 90% of all the firms we interviewed had solar PV panels as their alternative energy source, which I think it's alarming. But the households had about 16% of the total sample having solar PV panels, and only 2% had access to solar PV panels as an alternative energy source. So looking at the results from the mixed logic model, we can see that there is a higher preference for solar PV panels, followed by biomass, with power generators being their least preferred energy source. Interestingly, our sample preferred to choose any of these energy sources that were provided by a foreign service provider other than a domestic service provider. Of course, they wouldn't want a low service quality as it tends to reduce their utility. There's a high preference for high service quality. Interestingly, firms, on the other hand, even though had a higher preference for solar PV panels, had power generators as their second most preferred alternative. This is not surprising, as most of them already had that as their alternative energy source, with biomass being their least preferred energy source. Amidst these results, we also employed a latent class model to analyze further the heterogeneity in these preferences, considering the significance of the standard deviation associated with the coefficients. So proceeding to the latent class model, we chose a 3-class latent class model for the household level. Even though on average, most households preferred solar PV panels, we can see from the results that, yes, the latent class model, members of class 1 and 2 confirmed that result, but then unfortunately, members of class 3 prefer solar power generators, as their second preferred alternative as compared to what the main results suggested. Firms, on the other hand, with their latent class model, firms, on the other hand, excuse me. Firms, on the other hand, the results from the 3-class latent class model from the firms also confirms the mean results from the original mixed logic model. And of course, there is a low preference for low service quality. Moving to the willingness to pay estimates for households. So in the experiment, households and firms were presented with various levels, various percentages of a share of their annual income they would like to spend to purchase any of the alternatives they preferred. We included a monthly cost attribute because most energy firms in Ghana come to you and then they present you with these alternatives after you purchase whatever alternative you prefer. Usually every month it comes with additional cost. So that's the reason why a monthly cost after you've purchased your preferred alternative was added to the experiment. And then overall, we realized that there was a higher willingness to pay estimates for solar PV panels, which correlates with their preferences, same as biomass and then power generators. Because of time, we'll just move to conclude. So in conclusion, the whole conclusion of the experiments, we realized that firms, household has a very high preference for solar PV panels and then biomass and generators. Sorry, solar PV panels with households second best alternative being biomass and firms second best alternative being power generators. This indicates that there is a consumer base for solar PV panels, and considering the fact that most of the sample size had a higher preference for foreign service providers as compared to domestic service providers, means there needs to be an action to improve on the renewable energy sector in Ghana to attract firms and households to come in for these alternatives. And we recommend these policy recommendations from the study. There is a renewable energy master plan active in my country, Ghana, which was implemented in 2019 to increase the energy mix to include more renewables. But then the issue now is that already about 17% of the total population do not have access to electricity. So the priority now remains increasing access to electricity other than increasing, tackling the issue of pollution that comes as a result of electricity generation. So in this regard, there needs to be a reformation of the policy, considering people's preferences. There needs to be a reformation of the policy to train the local energy developers to make it more attractive for people to sign up to domestic firms that produce these alternative energy sources. And also we realized that biomass was also second preferred, but most of the policy right now is more focused on solar technologies. And for now, we do not know if any exist on biomass. So there is a need, considering the preferences, to also train local energy developers on biomass electricity generation technologies to to promote and improve the adoption of both. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like now to invite Becky Mbebe, who will be the discussant for this paper. We have 4 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Jacob, and thank you, Angela, for that presentation. I enjoyed reading the paper, and I think it does broadly meet your research objectives. I think one or 2 points that I was impressed with is your sample size and your response rate, which were quite good. And I could also relate to the methodology that you used to most recent similar studies. And then there is just a few questions, perhaps areas that we could jointly think about. Firstly is the comprehensiveness of your energy sources. I noticed that you only focused on biomass and solar, and you did not go into other sources of gas. I think in the morning there was a strong push towards gas. There was a strong push towards gas, or gas came in as one of the energy sources that would carries a lot of promise. So that's one issue that I picked. Secondly, your area of focus, it was strictly on Kumasi. And I was wondering if it doesn't weaken your case, or expansion beyond Kumasi will strengthen your case. And thirdly, I observed that you, in your recommendation particularly, you are saying for the consumers, credit terms could probably make a difference, and then for firms, we are saying subsidies will make sense in terms of uptake. Then the question that comes to mind is, why not consider, or why consider subsidies for firms and credit terms for consumers? And that takes me to another point to say, your focus was on middle income class. We need to be deliberate on how to include the other, the low income grouping. So I think if we sharpen, I know why you did that, but I think if we are deliberate on how we will then crowd in, so that we are not seen to be excluding some population groups. I think broadly those were the issues that I could immediately pick up from here. Yeah, it's those four. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Becky. We're going to move on to the next paper. We'll have an open discussion after all the papers have been presented. So I'd like to invite Till Jofung Njivuku to present his paper on natural resources, renewable energy, and governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good afternoon to all. The title of my presentation is Natural Resources, Renewable Energy and Governance, a Path Towards Sustainable Development. Actually, the background of the study starts from the fact that efforts to meet the sustainable development goal has been held by several factors. And one of these factors is persistent pollution of the environment. And renewable energy has been viewed by a way out of this backwardness. Equally, Africa is strategically positioned to benefit specifically from renewable energy investment. And this is because of the abundance of natural resources around the continent. Equally, looking at the sustainable development goals, goal number 7 stressed on the importance of clean and affordable energy sources for all. And equally, in 2018, the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment stressed on the importance of natural capital for the African economy. And also, the conference acknowledged the crucial role of natural resources in meeting the sustainable development agenda, and equally in attaining the 2063 African Union agenda for development. Looking at the abundance of natural resources in Africa, it is worth stressing that Africa is home to about 30% of the world mineral reserves, 12% of the world's oil, 40% of gold, and up to 90% of chromium and platinum. Unfortunately, recent studies have established that despite this abundance of natural resources, non-renewable energy sources, still increasingly constitute about 2/3 of electricity generation around the continent. Looking at the aspect of governance, 10 African countries featured in the top 20 politically unstable countries in 2020, and a similar number among the most corrupt countries that same year. It is in this respect that we set out two specific objectives for this study. Firstly, to examine the effect of natural resource endowment on renewable energy development in Africa. And secondly, to verify the modulating effect of governance in this relationship. The paper covers 48 African countries with data collected between the years 2000 to 2020. Our methodology involves the specification of two linear models. First of all, a model with renewable energy as the dependent variable and natural resources and governance as two explanatory variables of interest. And secondly, another model capturing the modulating effect of governance in that relationship. We use the system generalized method of moments and the quanti-regression methodologies in order to obtain our results. And the following results were arrived at. Firstly, natural resources and governance have enhancing effects on renewable energy in Africa. And this result is robust when different specifications of natural resources are used. And it is equally robust when different specifications of governance are used. And this positive effect of natural resources can be explained simply by the fact that natural resources rent can come as an extra capital that comes to add the existing stock of capital within the African economy. And this capital can be used for investment in different economic sectors, including the energy sector. And when governance was used as a modulating variable, it is shown that governance interact with natural resources, producing synergy positive effects, which means a degradation in the quality of governance will lead to a resource curse on the energy sector in the continent, and vice versa. And similar results were equally arrived at when alternative specification of governance were used in the indirect relationship. As a conclusion, we can return then from this study that natural resources enhance renewable energy investment in Africa, and that good governance is necessary for efficient investment in renewable energy in Africa, and that the interaction between governance and natural resources, good governance and natural resources produces positive net effects. As policy implications, it is vital, first of all, for policymakers around the continent to focus on how to improve on the governance quality of their different countries as a way out of the resource curse that the continent suffers from. And it is equally important that part of the resource rent obtained by the different governments should be allocated for renewable energy investment. With that, I've come to the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting paper. And I'd like to invite Ademonkun Misinahun to be a discussant, please. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I would like to go straight to the point to not waste my 4 minutes. I want first to congratulate you for the effort you have done on this reflection on the available natural resources and renewable energy. I have 3 points to make. The first one is on the theoretical framework. You stated a theoretical framework, but we will have wanted to have more explanation on this theoretical framework so that it constitutes a solid rationale for your relationship that you test. Because you just stated, but for instance, the theoretical framework, you say that is that available natural resources are available capital that a country can use to invest in development priority. But it doesn't say anything about why and how a government would choose to invest specifically in renewable energy. Because we have many development priority, precisely why and how the government would choose to invest in renewable energy, you did not discuss that. And we have not seen the link between the empirical literature that you discussed and this theoretical framework. It would have been good to link these two. And the second point is on the method. Some of your methodological choices were not justified. We did not have the rationale. For instance, why you introduced trade openness in the relationship as a covariate. You did not you discuss it in the result, but we will want to know the rationale for using some of the variables that you use. For instance, why did you introduce the lag of your dependent variable in the equation? You did not discuss that. We don't know why you did that. What was the rationale for doing that? And my last point is on the policy implication. To me, it seems that there is an important result that you overlook while discussing your policy implication, because you found that the relationship between natural resources and renewable energy depend on the type of the available natural resources. Precisely, you found that when you have oil or coal, the relationship is negative. So we will want you to discuss that and see what are the policy incentive or policy implication of this, because this is very important in terms of just energy transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very useful comments. We now have the first presenter with us. I would like to invite Dr. Elania Kalu Nduka to present his paper on reducing carbon footprint and replacing generators with solar PV systems. Please, you have 7 minutes. We're going to have the presentation on the screen in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present my paper. So reducing carbon footprint by replacing generators with solar PV systems, a contingent valuation study in Lagos, Nigeria. So I'm Elania Nduka, a teaching fellow at the University of Warwick. So I just want to mention, in case I'm not able to complete the presentation. So this paper has been published in Environment and Development Economics. So you can read the paper if you're interested. It's no longer news that the world is at a climate tipping point, and this is as a result of the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, links to the use of fossil fuel, as we've been discussing today. So I'm no longer going to mention some of the things that have been already said. Well, we know that the world is trying to transition to net zero carbon in the year 2050. But the question is Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa ready for this transition? As we've heard in the morning, we still have over 65% of Sub-Saharan African electricity generation based on fossil fuel. And installed capacity is just about 5 gigawatts in the region, which is less than 1% of the world's total. And as a substitute or as a backup, many households and businesses rely on backup generators. And in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, generators produce about 45 gigawatts of power. And this is more than all the renewables generating capacity. Nigeria alone, out of the 45 gigawatts you saw, Nigeria alone produces 13 gigawatts. So the question is, why is Nigeria so dependent on fossil fuel and in fact the highest importer of backup generators in the world? Well, as a result of this, Nigeria is caught up in the web of inadequate access and environmental degradation from the use of alternative source of energy, especially the backup generators. So what are the constraints then? What are the constraints to energy transition in Africa, particularly in Nigeria? So one of the issues is affordability. So most households are not able to afford the upfront cost of solar energy. Another one is myopia, or what we call short-sightedness. Of course, it's been mentioned here that people prefer $1 today to $1 tomorrow. So people tend to undervalue the value we get from solar or renewable energy in general. So because the cost of backup generators is quite cheaper in the short run, as a result, people want to rely on that compared to solar energy, which is more cost effective in the long run. Another one is lack of information. Most people don't even know that you can get electricity or energy from the sun. Then we have regulatory issues. For instance, high import duty that is being imposed on renewable energy technology. So these are just some of the constraints. There are many, many others that you can find in the literature. Now the question is, we have seen the constraints. What are we supposed to do? What are we going to do? Well, an effective way, because this study focuses on households. So an effective way to help households to transition to renewable energy, or if you like, to solar PV, is through subsidy. That has not been mentioned today. Another way is through an installment payment. So where households pay, so they are giving the solar energy, and they pay monthly just the way they pay their electricity bills. So these two policies, subsidy and installment payment, have actually contributed in the UK and generate up to 193.9 megawatts of electricity. So through what we call energy communities. So we have more than 300 energy communities in the UK. So Africa can also copy this policy. So now, what are the research questions that we investigate? One is, what is the willingness to pay when solar PV is complemented with a generator? Two, what is the willingness to pay when solar PV completely displaces generator? And three, by how much would a 20% subsidy change willingness to pay in both scenarios? So we have altogether 4 scenarios in this paper. And is it viable to invest in solar energy by investors? Okay, so design and data, just briefly. So we employed the bounded dichotomous choice CV equations to elicit households' willingness to pay. And that was done in Lagos, carried out focus group, and even pilot study before we did that. So because of budget limitation, we only surveyed 350 households. So if you look at these diagrams, you see that the acceptance rate declines with higher bids or bid levels, if you like. This is consistent with theory. So, and the coefficient of the bid is consistent in all the models across all the scenarios. So we have a negative coefficient, which means as the bid level increases, willingness to pay declines. So in the first scenario, where generators complement solar PV, households are willing to pay around $9.53. Then in the second scenario, where we displace generators, they are willing to pay $11. How about when we give households 20% subsidy, okay, and they complement PV, solar PV with their generators? They said they are willing to pay $8.76. Then when we display generators, they're even willing to pay more, around $14. Okay? So now, well, we did a cost benefit analysis to show that it is actually feasible and profitable for investors to invest in Nigeria using the method that we've just recommended, that is the installment payment option. Now, what are the takeaways, the main findings? One is that the willingness to pay for home solar system is higher when it can displace generators completely. Generator users are willing to pay more for home solar systems than their counterparts only when it can replace generators. Subsidy increases willingness to pay, or if you like, positive bidders by about 6%. Then on average, home solar system will save each household around $72. So it's even more economical to use solar PV than to rely on generators. Recommendations or conclusions. So transitioning to renewable energy will solve many environmental problems associated with fossil fuel burning, as all of us know. And there is a need to subsidize the cost of solar energy. Policymakers should promote what we call community energy or ESUSU energy organizations, or if you like, rotating savings and credit energy association. This is one of the main recommendations in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Ali Zafar to be our discussant for this paper. Please, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and good paper. So I have 4 comments in 4 minutes. The first comment is, I think the paper is innovative, it's very clear, it's well written, and it provides a very good empirical foundation using micro data to address an important policy question. So I congratulate the author for that. My second point is that the results are quite convincing, that the results show that the subsidy gives a lot of advantages, and so the households prefer the subsidy. They also prefer to replace the generator with the PV, with the solar PV. So I think that follows the literature, and it follows a lot of what we would expect as economists intuitively from the household behavior. So I think those are my 2 kind of points. The 2 challenges are, the third point is the sample size large enough? We have 350 households. Is this a large enough sample? Number 2, they are mostly average age is 37. Also, it's drawn from Lagos. Is Lagos representative of the rest of urban Nigeria? Do we have some selection bias? Would the results be the same if it was 1,000 observations drawn from throughout the country? And I think that's and my next point is probably the most challenging one, which is when you look at the results of this paper, it shows that the subsidy element, that the amount that they trade off is much less in Nigeria than in other countries. So it's hard to understand intuitively what that means. What is the magnitude of subsidy that government would need to give to households to make them move from generator to solar PV? Nigeria is probably the best experiment in Africa of 7 hours of sunshine. It's the country where solar could really take off, but the financing is hard to understand. So would it mean, what is the implication of expanding the subsidy? What is the fiscal effect on the government budget? And if you bring in private investors, can they make a scale contribution, or would they need to be subsidized by the government? So I think the mathematics of the subsidy need a bit more clarification because it seems too narrow. And there's I think some robustness that one has to look at. But on the whole, I think that the paper is good. It can probably get a bit more into the policy implications, a bit more into sensitivity, into robustness tests, but it's a good paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. We're going to move on to our fourth paper, Eco-efficiency and carbon emission abatement cost in the charcoal value chain in the Congo Basin. If we could please load up the presentation, and I invite Mr. Mustafa Munmeni to present the paper. Please. 7 minutes.
Bonjour, moi c'est M. Moumouni Mustafa, l'université de... Oui, je suis Moumouni Mustafa.
Good afternoon, I'm Mustafa, University of Maryland. During COP27, which was held last month in Egypt, the stakeholders committed to accelerate the reduction of CO2 thanks to a mechanism for reducing damage. It is in this context that we are submitting to you a paper entitled Eco-efficiency and reduction of costs of CO2 in the Congo Basin with the proofs from Cameroon. So my plan for the presentation will be as follows: introduction, methodology, and then discussion and conclusion. In the Congo Basin, which is still in the world, the mix is dominated by biomass. And firewood is also one of the sources of energy. In these sources, we see firewood identified as a main source of CO2 emission in the Congo Basin. Moreover, this also explains the production of energy and can explain also the concept of co-efficiency, which was introduced in 1985 and explains how to have a less negative influence on the environment.
Il est devenu par ailleurs une méthode d'évaluation standardisée. Et il a été reconnu comme l'un des meilleurs instruments d'élaboration des politiques économiques et environnementales. Dans ce mouvement, son application dans divers domaines de la littérature.
We have seen the literature, various arguments, even if charcoal has been going through some challenges. So we have increased demand from man and also climate change, but no document has been able to mobilize this instrument in order to establish the economic concerns and the environmental concerns. Now, in order to overcome these challenges, we have primary and secondary data, and primary data has been gotten thanks to funding from Conservation Action Network. And so we had a sample of more than 400, and so different people from different areas in Cameroon, in the forest, and also in the savannah. And in the microeconomic approach, we have two methodologies. We have the mathematical approach that is a stochastic analysis. And when we look at the literature, the specification, the stochastic specification is good when you look at the empirical work. So this takes into account the statistics and differentiates these specifications. And with that, we can able to see hyperbolic measures of the environmental and financial aspects. And so we have seen that when you use the duality between we can determine the cost in terms of how we can reduce carbon emissions. The interpreter apologizes, the sound is breaking up. In the empirical model, we have 4 production factors that enable us to have 2 kinds of products. The first one, we have the second one is CO2 emissions. So we know the price of charcoal because there is a market that exists, but there's really isn't a market for CO2 emissions so that we can determine the cost of CO2 emissions. We have also tried to see now, after the different studies, we have the following results. We realize the speaker's sound is intermittent and therefore not interpretable. The interpreters apologize. In the forest, we have seen now, with regard to the eco-efficiency scores, we see that worldwide, we have seen that charcoal producers can have 45.76 by reducing their emissions for CO2. In the forests, they can reduce their emissions. And in the savannah, they have the possibility of increasing charcoal production by 83% and reducing the CO2 emissions. Now, in terms of the opportunity costs, in order to reduce by 1 kilo of CO2, we have determined that this cost is a shadow price is about 6,000 in the forests. In the savannah, it's about 8,000 CFA francs. And in conclusion, the main conclusions that we have are as follows. We realize that the sources of eco-efficiency in the charcoal value chain are different in each socio-ecological zone. the producers also have the possibility of improving their eco-efficiency, and we can actually reduce CO2 even if we increase production. So we need to diversify the sources of charcoal. And in terms of abandoning charcoal production in order to reduce CO2, NGOs and specialized agencies can have compensation mechanisms, carbon credits, and so forth that could incite charcoal producers that could reduce their emissions even if they are still producing charcoal. It makes more sense for the SAIS to look at other sources of energy instead of offering compensations. And so we hope that in the future, students are going to be able to answer this question if they study this question to see the comparison, the investment that the state would put in place, and to see what would happen if they opted for alternative means. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Wainmi Umamulu, who is an online discussant. So if we could please have Wainmi join us online to discuss the paper.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I'm not able to turn on my camera.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
So yes, thank you so much for this presentation and this paper, which I found very interesting, and a very interesting way of modeling the determinants of eco-inefficiency in the charcoal production value chain. And I just want to go straight into my observations and comments rather than talk more about the actual modeling and the paper itself and the content. So what I would have liked to see, because of this is kind of a little bit of an abstract model for a policymaker reading something like this. It's very theoretical, and there's not a lot of explanation of the factors that you mention in the production process. In the savannah, for example, which is one of the areas that I was actually most struck by the results there, that leads to higher eco-inefficiency outcomes, right? So these are factors that are within the control of producers themselves. So they would yield very practical and immediate policy actions that can be taken. One of the things that you mentioned is that obtaining water was a factor in this region. But it's not really clear why the water source, you say it's far away, you say that it's also subject to competition from other users of that water resource. So, but why do those factors in and of themselves produce more greenhouse gas emissions? I didn't quite understand. You also highlight that greenhouse gas emissions from charcoal in sub-Saharan Africa is higher than the global average, which is very interesting. We always think about, sub-Saharan Africa as being the region that contributes less to environmental degradation, but actually, probably on the carbon dioxide emissions, but not necessarily greenhouse gases. So it's interesting to know that sub-Saharan Africa accounts for a third of greenhouse gas emissions, if that's correct. So, in certain respects, it's actually quite a large producer of some of these emissions. So that was interesting to know. But the point here is that you had an opportunity to do some comparative analysis. Why is it that, in whichever country that produces less greenhouse gas emissions through the production, the value chain of charcoal production, what makes their emissions lower than in Cameroon? So this would have actually helped you to come up with those practical steps in the production process that Cameroon can take. So maybe you'll talk about that more later on in your responses. So I also was very interested in this separation of the different components of greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions from charcoal production, one of which of course comes from the production process itself, and then the other one comes from deforestation. And you say diversify the sources of charcoal. But really, how have you actually assessed what impact that would actually have? You're still deforesting, but it's more diffuse, is what you seem to be suggesting with that recommendation. So sustainable methods of charcoal production produce negligible amounts of CO2 emissions. Did I get that correct? But harvesting raw material is necessary for charcoal production. So is any charcoal production environmentally sound? That's my question to you. You highlight that demand for fuel is only going to grow up, this kind of fuel. There are two alternatives that you consider. So if charcoal is the only it isn't, but in your paper it seems to suggest as a dominant energy source in Cameroon, then is this going to be sustainable because it will lead to deforestation anyway? And how does this fit into Cameroon's non-determined contributions as part of the Paris Accords? I thought that, I'm not an expert in this, I know a little bit about it, but my impression was that the idea was to phase out all these kinds of high carbon emitting fuels, charcoal included, by 2050. So why are we actually, this actually make it relevant in the context, in the global context that we are seeing? And then you don't also go into any gender impacts on the consumption side. Obviously producing charcoal produces greenhouse gases, CO2 emission, but also consuming it, burning it as fuel must also contribute to that. So what about the CO2 emissions from that angle? And then isn't it just better to encourage governments to switch to alternative sources, not only because of the Paris Accords, but also from the health perspective? We know that women and girls are more exposed to these kinds of dirty fuels. They cook more, etc. When you look at all the costs in aggregate, I think that maybe you will find that it's just not worth pursuing any form of charcoal production in the long term. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Waimi, for that excellent discussion. And now we move on to our last paper, Productivity Costs of Green Energy Transition in Africa by Dr. Ligani Masamba Sene. Please, you have 7 minutes. Could we load the presentation, please? Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I'm Ligan Sen, and I will be presenting a paper on the productivity cost of green energy transition, a paper that I did in collaboration with Ella Schall. Both of us are from UNDP. So we know that as per the discussion this morning, we have a wide consensus that green energy transition will be reducing the fossil fuel, but also will be having tangible economic benefit. But at the same, we don't have also to overlook some kind of productivity effects that you may have. And most of the time also, we don't take into account that when we talk about the green energy transition, but we wanted to think out of the box to see, okay, when we talk about green justice energy transition, we are trying to see how we can balance the burden of the energy transition between the different countries. But most of the time also, when we look at this burden, we only focus on the financial aspect, but also the climate damage aspect. But we never talk about potential, let's say, adverse effects that we can have from the economic perspective. So that's why we wanted to undertake this research to see how within the African context, we can ascertain the fact that going toward renewable energy will be having an impact on the productivity based on the competition that you might have between the different sectors, but also based on the constraints on the resources, because in many African countries, we have the labor and the capital factors that are skewed towards the sector dependent, let's say, energy. So what we did is that we try to have a quick overview of the literature. And here I'm just presenting the analysis that was done and that are somehow related, whether in terms of finding or in terms of the methodology that they use to house own study. And we can quickly quote the study that was undertaken by Dogan and that revisited prior study done by Inglesis and that found that renewable energy consumption positively affect economic growth, but only for the lower and low middle quintile. But when you take, let's say, renewable energies as being, let's say, measure in terms of, let's say, substitution with regard to the other source of energy, they found that the impact is negative for all the quintile. So we can quote also on studies that was done on the BRICS countries that shows that there is no evidence of relationship between the renewable energy and the total factor productivity growth. So yes, within Africa, we don't have that much of studies that try to look the impact on productivity. Some of them try to look the impact on the, let's say, growth. But I think why this is important is because we know that climate change itself is impacting productivity. But now that we are trying to bring renewable energy, we have to make sure that we won't be having a negative impact on productivity itself, because it will be like you bring a solution and then you end up seeing that the solution is somehow hampering what you wanted to solve initially. And we think also that by using the total factor productivity, there is a mean to create some kind of linkages between the reduced form of energy econometric models that we have here and wide model like TGE that will help us goes beyond the total factor productivity and assess also the impact on other variables. And we tried also to control with, let's say, more traditional source of total productivity growth in, let's say, the general economic literature. So here, just an overview of where we stand in terms of the renewable energy. We can see that biomass is the major component, and we can see also that we lag behind in terms of the solar or energy related to the wind. So quickly to give you an overview of what our modeling exercise look like. So here we are just trying to explain the total factor productivity fluctuation by a block of variables related to renewable energy, but also traditional variables that I just mentioned, and that include trade openness to take into account the diffusion of technology, but also variable related to human capital. So we estimated a set of econometric model, and the end objective was to estimate a fully modified OLS to allow us to take into account the co-integrations that we have in our variables. So just to give you the overview of the results that we have, and in terms of description of the results, we can see that, yes, we found a negative impact of renewable energy on productivity. And we also see that the results are consistent across the econometric model. And we see also that an auto-regressive effect related to the productivity level itself, and impact also has expected of some of the variable like human capital, but also variable related to trade, but not for the panel of subset of African countries. So in terms of policy recommendation of this study, I think the first objective was to ascertain that, yes, beyond the impact that is related to potential damage on the climate, beyond also the impact that is related to the financial cost of this renewable energy, we have an additional impact that is related to productivity. And we think also that when designing renewable energy policy, we have to make sure that we integrate this productivity dimension. So concretely, that means that we have to ascertain that we have a mix of energy between policies mix of policies, sorry, between those related to macroeconomic, those related to industry, and those related to labor and sector, so that we ensure that while we pursue the transition to renewable energy, we make sure that the productive gain also that we fought so hard to get won't be lost. And we have also to pay attention to the competition that we may have between agricultural food crop and non-food energy related crop, because they will be also competing in terms of factors. And we have also to make sure that we create measure, whether in terms of social safety net, that compensate those that are, let's say, disproportionately affected by the transition. And then promote also policies that strengthen the readiness mechanism to move to, let's say, new green energy related, let's say, infrastructure. And to ensure also that we allocate, when we do the allocation of the resources to renewable energy, we make sure also that we avoid some kind of, let's say, crowd-out effect on other type of investment in other type of sectors, like those that are labor intensive or those that are productivity enhancing sectors. And then lastly, we have to ensure that the transition doesn't also affect the, let's say, poorest households or the businesses that don't have the capacity to afford some of the, let's say, new technologies that will be introduced, or that are affected by high production or productivity costs. So that's all about our study, and here is a snapshot of the countries that we included in our sample of African countries. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to invite my colleague Palani to have a quick discussion. 4 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank both authors, Lagani and Elkaji, for choosing a very interesting, timely topic. The objective of this paper is very clear. The paper tried to analyze the impact of a gradual transition of renewable energy on the total factor productivity. The objective is very clear, the topic is very relevant, and it's very timely. So therefore, I wanted to appreciate for the authors. I have 5 set of comments. I know that, the moderator gave me 4 minutes. Let me just try to wrap up 5 comments. The first is that on the title, the first comments on the title, productivity cost of energy transition. That actually is starting with the -1. I would suggest that productivity implication of energy transition. The reason is that the development literature, even some of the literature review done this study, highlight that energy transition bring large productivity gain, productivity benefits on number of channel. The paper did not highlight the channel, but for the benefit of author, I would like to start with that. The productivity gain comes through the energy transition, tend to promote economic diversification, try to bring new technology, try to improve the kind of new type of economic activities. There are a number of channels. It's also energy transition, reduce the carbon emission. When the labor work in a pollution-free environment, they tend to produce more efficient. So there are a number of channels in which the energy transition would actually bring a large total factor productivity gain. So that's my first comment, that you should start with the productivity implication, not the productivity cost, which is the negative implication. The second one on the introduction, at least the paper, it's not comes out very clearly on the problem statement. I would like to actually request the authors to add 1 or 2 paragraphs. Try to strengthen the problem statement. On the methodology section, I would like to again suggest that the authors, when they present the model, try to actually highlight the channels in which the energy transition would influence the total factor productivity is important in order to actually a priori, before going to the analytical work, to determine the expected sign, whether it's a positive effect, whether it's a negative effect. So that actually you need to establish the channels and the a priori, the sign of the modeling independent variable. So that is on the analytical framework section. On the interpretation, the paper adopted 4 different models. Some models, the relationship is positive, some relationship, the relationship is negative, even on the impact of human capital formation on productivity. We all know that the human capital formation will have positive impact on productivity gain. But the paper has, in a different model, have negative sign. The paper is not actually presented the results, not try to actually interpret the results. Actually, the usefulness of the paper will come why you have that kind of negative sign. Whether it is the misspecification of the variable. For example, the paper has import variable. If the import is a total import, if the country import the food import, final goods import, then it may not have positive impact on productivity, because if it is a use only the capital import, the import which is a technology intensive, then it will tend to have positive impact on productivity. If not, if you use the total import, then it may have any sign. So therefore, there is a possibility of misspecification of the variable. So that is on the interpretation problem. And the last section on the policy implication, I really like the presentation here. It come out with some of the lot of interesting policy implication. But the paper I read yesterday, there is hardly anything, interesting policy recommendation. And my comment there is that even the policy implication presented here, it is not coming from the analysis. It comes on the generic way. So wherever possible, we need to draw the policy implication based on the analysis of the paper, not just throw the policy implication outside the analytical work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Palani. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we won't have time for discussion, but I would like to thank our 5 brilliant researchers. Please join me in a round of applause. And if anyone has a question, please send it to us in writing to either UNDP, ECA, or AFDB, and we will forward it to the researchers. Thank you very much. Good job.
Today is gonna be the day we're gonna throw it back to you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues. Let's go on to the next session, session 3 on debt sustainability and climate smart development in Africa. Let me have the pleasure to call to the stage the distinguished panelists who are going to help us in this important